Great. All right. Well, I will kick it off here as we wait for some people to trickle in. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today for our Activate Sustainability webinar. Really excited for the presentations that are coming up here soon. So today we're having three presentations by Lena Upsheva, Maddie Lemons, and Cal Svertaran about sustainability reporting. So really excited to have everyone here today and speak about that. Um, shall we get started with the presentation, Crystal? Awesome. Let me just change my screen here. Perfect. All right. Great. So thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Rachel. I am the Sustainability Manager with DEC. And happy to invite you all to our Activate Sustainability webinar today. Before I get started, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. So DEC is located on the traditional territories of the Treaty 7 nations in Southern Alberta, as well as the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. And today I am calling in from Quebec City and speaking with you from the traditional unceded territory of the Huron-Wendat people. All right, next slide, please, Crystal. So a little bit about DEC. So Decentralized Energy Canada is a national industry association. We are dedicated to the development of decentralized energy, and our main offering is a networking pathway for businesses. And we hold a variety of networking events throughout the year, as well as our Decentralized Energy Forum, which we are happy to host again this year in Ottawa in November. And if you would like more information on that, it's a wonderful opportunity for networking in the decentralized energy industry. We will be announcing that on our LinkedIn and our Twitter shortly, so be sure to follow us, and you can head to our website, deassociation.ca, and subscribe to our newsletter to be up to date with all of our upcoming events. Our other offering are our programs, so we offer all types of things from community energy project enablement. We do some work with Global Affairs Canada, their CanExport program, and supporting export-ready Canadian companies gain access to foreign markets. We also do some work with the Standards Council of Canada, creating standardized terminology to be used across the decentralized energy industry in Canada. Those are our main programs that are going on right now, as well as our Activate program, which is why we're here today. So next slide. Oh, actually, I'll give you a few stats about DEC. So we have over 10,000 active subscribers worldwide. We have over 20 years of experience in the industry, over 100 members, and our members operate in over half of Canada's provinces and territories. Next slide, please, Crystal. So our Activate Sustainability program is really focused on sustainability reporting and integrating the Sustainable Development Goals into sustainability reporting. And sustainability reporting really is the disclosure and communication of various metrics, often relating to environmental, social, and governance, ESG goals, or other sustainability goals, as well as a company's progress towards them. The metrics can also factor in the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, which are becoming very prominent in sustainability reporting as organizations look to make themselves more sustainable and attract impact investment. And our speakers today, Lena, Maddie, and Cal, will all fill you in on the value of this kind of reporting for your organization, both from a global and a local perspective, and how you can get started today. So our Activate program really, we are conducting it with support from the federal government, and we are looking to increase awareness for the accessibility of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and sustainability reporting, and making these more relevant to the decentralized energy industry. And along with this webinar, we are compiling a sustainability framework that is tailored to the decentralized energy industry, and that is our Activate framework. And it's currently being reviewed by our advisory committee, which is a group of experts that we've brought together to ensure its relevancy and accessibility. And we are offering it to our members as a way to get started with sustainability reporting. And if you're interested in learning more about it, or if you'd like to sign up as one of our early adopters, please reach out to me. You can contact me at my email, rgradine@deassociation.ca. I'll put that in the chat. And if you go to the next slide, please, Crystal, you'll see it up there as well. So really hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Thank you again for joining us. We will have a 15-minute Q&A portion at the end of the session, and I will pass it off to my colleague Alicia to do that part. So please feel free to pop your questions in the Q&A box or in the chat throughout the webinar. And yeah, thank you everyone. Thank you to our speakers. And I will hand it off to our first speaker, Lena of SEB Group. Thanks.
Maybe a good idea to unmute myself first before I start speaking. Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you to GC for inviting me to be a part of this awesome event. So my name is Lena Avshova. I'm an analyst in climate and sustainable finance at SEB. And today I'll be talking to you a little bit about what sustainable finance even is, what is sustainable finance market, and also the role of transparency and reporting in the market. And before we move on, I realized that some of you might not be familiar with SEB. We are a Nordic bank with headquarters in Stockholm in Sweden, and we have a global presence. So for example, in North America, we have an office in New York, which represents our North American branch. But speaking about sustainable finance, again, before we move forward with the presentation, I thought I would just give a bit of, I guess, overview of what it is, even as a topic. If you think of finance in the traditional sense, you can say that is something that seeks to generate financial return, right? In the case of sustainable finance, it also seeks to generate financial return. However, in addition to that return, it also seeks to create a positive sustainable impact, so positive impact on the environment and on the society. So if we go to the next slide. Thank you, Crystal. Here, I'm not going to talk a lot about SEB, and here there is a lot of information about our bank and our role in the sustainable finance market. You're welcome to get the slides after the event and look at it in more detail, but for now, I just wanted to bring your attention to specifically 2008 here in the bottom left, where you can see that our journey, you can say, in sustainable finance started actually when the World Bank issued the first ever green bond. And SEB acted as a structural advisor to the World Bank on that transaction and actually helped develop this product in its first stages. And we'll be talking a little bit about green bonds and green loans during this presentation. And if we go to the next slide. So here is something that I like to call the sustainable finance ecosystem. And I wanted to show you this slide because I think it gives quite a nice overview and a picture of what it actually is that we do when we say sustainable finance as a bank. And here in the picture it says SEB, but really it's any bank that works with sustainable finance. So if you look at this little bubble, the circle or the ecosystem, in the top left, you see issuers and borrowers. And what that really means is basically anyone from a private individual to a small size company or a larger size company, or even a government that seeks to receive funding for sustainability purposes. And this can be done in two ways. So for example, they might want to get funding for specific projects, green projects or social projects. Or they might want to receive funding and then pay back on the loan based on their sustainability performance. So a company might outline specific sustainability targets. Let's say they will say that we will decrease our emissions over the next 5 years by this much, or we will increase the number of women in our board by this much in the next 5 years. And then the amount that they have to pay back to the bank or to the investors is kind of linked to how well they're actually doing and how sustainable they are. And as you can imagine, there is quite a lot of rules and I guess proper ways to do this that govern this market. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a couple of minutes. But there are also some external factors, as you can see, and it can be anything from consumer trends to regulations. I know Matthew will talk a little bit more about regulations quite soon, and it is a very important factor. Technological developments, policies, or even the activities of NGOs that affects the way that the market works and the market operates, and even what type of projects it is that companies want to borrow money to finance. And I mentioned bonds earlier, and the difference here between bonds and loans is very simple. So a bond is pretty much the same thing as a loan, except for usually is used for a larger amount of money. And when it comes to a bond, then it's investors that are providing the financing. And when it comes to a loan, it's the bank that provides the financing in most cases. So if we go to the next slide. And I'm sure that all of you are familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, probably also through the work of DEC. And I think the Sustainable Development Goals have impacted all areas of sustainability, and sustainable finance was, of course, not an exclusion here. And that is indeed something that you see quite a lot when it comes to reporting, also when it comes to reporting linked to sustainable financing and the financing that companies receive to work on their sustainability goals or projects. And there's actually something called the United Nations Global Compact, which was way before, and it can be called as a predecessor of Sustainable Development Goals. And it was a principle-based framework for businesses. And it stated the principles in the areas of human rights, labor, the environment, and also anti-corruption and other areas. And I think an important thing here to note is that is not only the environment that we are talking about when we say sustainable finance or sustainability in general. There's also social issues, as you know, something that is also highlighted in the Sustainable Development Goals. And in addition to that, there is a number of different initiatives and standards and disclosure recommendations that exist in the market. And these initiatives basically help companies navigate through this world of reporting, especially in relation to getting access to sustainable financing. And for example, there is an initiative called Principles for Responsible Investments, and that is something that helps investors look at, okay, how can we invest and actually say that we're investing sustainably? I'm not going to go into too much details. We don't have that much time, but I can definitely recommend looking into these different standards as they provide quite a lot of insight into these topics. So next slide, please. Here is quite a good, I think, illustration of how the sustainable debt market has grown. So basically, how much money actually companies and other entities seeking financing for sustainability purposes have borrowed year by year. And it's been growing exponentially over the past 10 years and more. And I think an interesting thing for you maybe to see is the growth in North American market in the difference between 2020 and 2021. And there, as you can imagine, the change in government in the United States has played quite a big role. So that, again, demonstrates the influence that outside factors such as policies and different forces in society can play in the access that companies get to sustainable financing. This year, as you can see, we are not seeing as much growth as we were definitely hoping for and expecting, unfortunately. And as you can imagine, the war in Ukraine played a big role. But we're expecting the market to bounce back quite rapidly in the coming years, especially as governments and companies are seeking to decrease their reliance and dependency on fossil energy. So if we go to the next slide. Yeah, this is something that is very important for the world of sustainable finance. And I really wanted to share this with you because I think this is something that really highlights the importance of reporting specifically. I just used green bond principles here as an example, but this is really true for all types of sustainable financing and sustainable finance products. And it could be applied to green loans as well. So, for example, we have quite a lot of SMEs coming to borrow money for sustainability purposes, and then they will have to go through these 5 steps as well. And these steps are not mandatory. So all of the principles that exist in the sustainable finance sphere are voluntary. However, for example, we as a bank at SEB, we will not lend money out unless it is done in accordance with these principles. And a lot of investors are of the same opinion. So they really want to see these principles followed. And what are these principles? They are, first of all, it's definition. So a company might define what exactly they want to finance through this funding that they're seeking. So what projects they are, and it could be something like, for example, installing solar panels on the roof of their factory, let's say. And then selection, so they select different projects. It could be a number of them. Third is monitoring. So they monitor that the money that they're borrowing is actually used for those purposes and nothing else. And fourth, very importantly, is reporting. So in order to be compliant with the green bond principles, a borrower has to report at least on an annual basis and preferably even have some sort of midterm reporting as well. And verification in the case of bonds is a second party opinion coming in and basically saying, yes, these projects are actually sustainable. But reporting, going back to, since that's the topic of today's event, is something that is truly the kind of red thread that goes through the opportunities that these companies have in order to get access to this type of financing, especially since investors will want to look at the history of reporting. So it doesn't have to be done necessarily in relation to financing. And also it will be something that we as a bank helping our client, a company, or even the government choose these different projects that they want to finance and that they can finance through sustainable finance. We'll have to look at their reporting taking years back to see, okay, what progress have they done and what progress can they do in order to get access to money. And actually, I think I'm going to stop here. And hopefully we have a bit more time for a discussion later in the panel. But I will hand the word. There are, as you can see, quite a lot of other slides in the presentation. So please feel free to reach out and I'm happy to send it to you along with some useful links. But now I'll hand the word over to Matti. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. That was great. My presentation is going to follow along on what you were talking about, but focus in on climate change related disclosure. So if we could go to the next slide here. Perfect. And then the next slide, I'll just do a brief overview here. So I'm just going to talk briefly about our current practices in Canada. As Lena sort of mentioned, you know, things aren't mandatory right now, but there could be a move to mandatory reporting soon. We're going to talk about what's happening south of the border down in the US. So the Securities Exchange Commission has proposed climate-related disclosure requirements. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some climate change litigation issues, just some key examples of what's happened, as well as what that could mean for businesses. So let's go to the next slide. So currently in Canada, disclosure is driven by security law concepts of materiality and relevance. There's no formal requirements for ESG. But there is increasing pressure, of course, to provide that kind of disclosure due to ESG focus by key financial institutions and pension funds. So I've given some examples here in Canada, the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, and over in Quebec as well. There's been some more focus on ESG. Let's go to the next slide, please. So there is a move towards mandatory reporting in Canada, though, and that's going to underscore the need to adapt here in our market. So the recent federal budget, it just came out a little bit ago. It's now calling for mandatory climate disclosure for federally regulated institutions starting in 2024, which includes banks and insurers, in accordance with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So there's also maybe going to be federally regulated pensions. That's just mentioned in the budget, but it's sort of to be announced coming forward. We don't know what time that'll come into place. So right now, we've got the securities commissions across Canada. They have a national instrument on reporting of climate change related risks. It's just a staff notice right now. It doesn't create any new legal requirements, nor does it modify any of the existing legal requirements. And disclosure, as I said, is still driven by materiality here in Canada, but companies that are seeking to invest or acting as financiers should be prepared with both external expertise and internal expertise on ESG disclosure, because it's coming. That's pretty clear. And you heard from Lena the importance of these ESG disclosures. Let's turn to the next slide so we can talk about what's happening south of the border. So this is the SEC down in the US. They released just back in March this year the proposed climate-related disclosure requirements. They're looking for public comments to come in right now. So, they could change from what I'm talking about today. But this is sort of the framework that they're looking at. They're proposing rules that require domestic and foreign registrants to include certain climate-related information in their registration statements and their periodic reporting. The rules were a response to investor concerns over the potential impacts of climate-related risks to individual businesses. But there's some controversy over the cost and benefit of these rules. There's obviously some businesses would be impacted more, and there would be a significant cost to this kind of disclosure. And is that of benefit to investors, or, is there some sort of materiality here that should be focused on? So these rules would amend the regulations down in the South in US for SEC filings. And there's certain metrics that should be followed. I'm going to talk about those. So let's turn to the next slide. So there are 7 main buckets of required disclosure. They're listed there, and we're going to go over them. The registrants may also identify any climate-related opportunities when responding to any of the mandated disclosure requirements. So overall, these proposed rules are more extensive, and they can be costly, depending on what type of business you're involved with. So let's turn to the next slide. And how do they define risks? So they've got a few different definitions here. They've got climate-related risks are actual or potential negative impacts of climate-related conditions and events on a registrant's consolidated financial statements, business operations, or value chains. So you can see it gets a little bit broader there. There's physical risks, which are risks to businesses and their assets arising from acute and chronic climate-related disasters. So wildfires, hurricanes, temperature increases, sea level rising. And then there's transition risks. And those are risks that are associated with transition to a potentially less carbon intensive economy. So these are a little bit, more intangible. They're market trends, regulatory risks, climate-related litigation, things that are coming up as businesses move forward into the future. They're a little bit harder to tell or anticipate, and certainly you don't want to have to anticipate climate-related litigation, but we're going to talk a little bit about that stuff here shortly. So let's turn to the next slide. So, impact of climate risk on business and financials. You should consider both physical and transition risks. And the standard is whether the risk is reasonably likely to have a material impact on the registrant's business or consolidated financial statements. And so for each risk, the registrant must specify whether it is a physical or a transition risk. For physical risks, the registrant must also disclose whether the risk is an acute or a chronic risk. And a matter is material, meaning whether to buy or sell securities or stocks, or how to vote. And then for number 2, we've got the effect of climate risks on strategy, business model. Once a registrant describes that material climate-related risks on their business, the registrant must describe the impact of those risks on their business operations, their products or services, their value chain, research development, activities to mitigate those risks or adapt to them, and any other significant changes or impacts on that business. And you should be including things like time horizons for the impact. Let's turn to the next slide. So the SEC also went on to talk about governance disclosure. So there's board and management oversight. So for board oversight, you should identify any board members or board committees responsible for the oversight of climate-related risks, disclose whether any member of the registrant's board of directors have expertise in climate-related risks and the nature of that expertise, describe processes and frequency by which the board discusses climate-related risks, how the board considers those risks as part of its business strategy, risk management, and financial oversight, and how, if at all, the board sets climate-related targets and goals, how it oversees the progress on those goals, including any interim goals. For management oversight, they want disclosure of the management's role in assessing and managing climate-related risks. They want to disclose any managerial positions or committees that are specifically dedicated to assessing and managing those types of risks. They want the expertise of those people. They want the processes by which the responsible managers or committees are informed about and monitor climate-related risks, and whether the management will report to the board on climate-related risks, and if so, how frequently. So you can see it's quite extensive. In risk management disclosure, they want to hear more about processes that are in play for that particular registrant to identify, assess, and manage climate-related risks. And it should allow investors to determine whether that company has made the assessment of climate-related risks a part of its regular risk management process. And that could include how the significance of such a risk is determined, how the company considers determining regulatory policies when identifying those risks, how it considers consumer trends, technology changes, market trends, or other transition risks, materiality of those risks, how to mitigate, accept, or adapt to the risk, how it prioritizes addressing those risks, and how it determines how to mitigate a high priority risk. Let's turn to the next slide, please. And so then on financial metrics, the SEC wants to hear about how registrants must also disclose climate-related financial statements in the notes of its financial statements. So there's sort of three main categories there. The financial impact metrics, which refers to disclosures of disaggregated information about the impact of climate-related conditions and events on the financial statements, done on a line-by-line basis. So pretty particular there. It's not dependent on materiality, but rather they've chosen a threshold of 1% of the total line item as their sort of threshold to have it be disclosed. And it includes the risks such as floods, severe weather conditions, rising sea levels, and those types of things. Then there's expenditure metrics, and that's the disclosure of expenditures related to mitigating the risk of climate-related risks. And then there's financial estimates and assumptions, and that's to disclose how those types of risks impact the estimates and assumptions in those financial statements. And so for each metric, the registrant should also disclose the contextual information around the metric, including any assumptions, and they should use the same accounting principles that they otherwise use in the rest of their financial statements. Let's turn to the next slide. So greenhouse gas emissions metrics. There's 3 different levels of emissions to be disclosed, and this gets quite complicated and granular. So Scope 1, 2, and 3, let's talk about those. They must all disclose, so all registrants with the SEC must disclose Scope 1 and Scope 3 emissions. But there's a recognition by the SEC right now that Scope 3 is a little bit more complicated. These are indirect emissions that could be upstream and downstream of the company's activities. So you can see that they they can be quite convoluted, right? If your business is about producing a certain product, then you might not necessarily normally take into account the transportation costs and what kind of emissions might be in those transportation issues. So, but that would be part of scope 3. So there's a little bit a safe harbor provision here. There's exemptions for certain types of liability for scope 3 emissions disclosure. Small companies are exempt, and there's some delayed compliance date for scope 3 disclosure as well. Let's turn to the next slide. So this is the last part of the proposed rules by the SEC. These are the targets and goals. So as we heard from Lena, there's sort of an increasing focus for investors and also environmental groups on this type of disclosure. If a company sets climate-related targets or goals, they better disclose them to the SEC and any action plans they have or timelines for achieving those goals. And that must be updated annually for each company. So it's not just something where you set it and forget it. You've got to keep updating on a regular basis. Let's turn to the next slide. So what does that mean? That's all in the US, of course. And so these proposed rules would apply to foreign registrants. So that could be Canadian companies that are active in the US market. And there's a potential, of course, we kind of follow what happens down south of the border typically. So we could see our Canadian securities commissions also having similar requirements in the near future. And they'll be looking to the SEC and the comments that they've received on their proposed rules here. So you should be getting ready to address those types of risks. Or you have the risk of losing capital because you can't get important investors, or the risk of regulatory enforcement or litigation once the mandatory reporting comes into effect. Let's turn to the next slide. Let's talk about a little bit of that climate change litigation. So this isn't, of course, supposed to be a scare tactic, but I want you to all be aware that when you're disclosing stuff, that can also get used in litigation. This is an area of lawsuits that's growing. We're seeing cases globally. In Canada, we're seeing, 26 cases in total. That doesn't sound like a lot, but they're kind of large scale ones. They're big dollar values. They're class actions sometimes. We're seeing, of course, a lot more in the US and also in the EU. Let's turn to the next slide. So let's talk about the ExxonMobil case. So here, the state of New York had alleged that Exxon had engaged in longstanding fraud by creating the illusion that Exxon had considered the risks of climate change and factored that risk into its operations. And that was not supported by facts and contrary, of course, to Exxon's internal practices. And so the idea was that Exxon had made materially false and false disclosures to the public in violation of the Martin Act in the New York state and the executive laws. However, the court ultimately held that there was no fraud, no misrepresentation. So the state had actually failed to prove that Exxon had made any misrepresentations that would have been viewed by the reasonable investor to have varied the total mix of information available to them. So this was, of course, heard in 2019. Let's go to the next slide, where Exxon is challenged by the Massachusetts court and states. And they allege that Exxon had systematically and intentionally misled Massachusetts investors and consumers about climate change, specifically through misrepresenting the material climate-related risks to its business and about how fossil fuel products cause climate change. And so they had alleged, again, some breaches of consumer protection statutes. And in June 2021, so only 2 years later, the court rejects Exxon's attempt to dismiss the case on the basis of failing to have a jurisdiction and failing to state a claim. So you can see that only 2 years had gone by, and Exxon thought, okay, well, I had won the last one, so this should be a slam dunk. This case is a nothing. But now the court's actually saying, I don't know, I'm going to let this case kind of move forward and see how it goes. So something could come of that. Another good example out of the EU was the the case of Shell recently. So in May 2021, the Hague District Court ruled that Shell was obliged to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030 compared to 2019 levels after environmentalist groups had brought a class action against Shell for the breach of an unwritten standard of care rooted in the Dutch Civil Code. And so the court relied on international agreements and treaties such as the Paris Agreement and human rights treaties to get to that standard. And they said that Shell had an obligation to protect human rights, and they recognized a responsibility for companies to account for their Scope 3 emissions as part of their duty to protect human rights. So sort of those upstream and downstream activities of the businesses. So you can see that there's a different flavor of what's going on in the courts in the EU than maybe in the US to date. A little bit stronger protection of environmental issues in the EU so far. Let's turn to the next slide. So, only in March of this year, Client Earth, an environmental law organization, and shareholders of Shell sent a letter before they brought action against Shell's directors personally for breach of fiduciary duties in failing to articulate a credible net zero plan after announcing in their 2021 AGM that it aims to become net zero by 2050. So we haven't seen this litigation get started yet, but they've certainly put the Shell directors on notice that they could be personally liable for actually articulating credible goals and plans to get to the goals. So if litigated, this would be the first case that I'm aware of to hold directors liable for failing to align internal business strategy with the company's commitment under climate policies on the basis of a breach of fiduciary duties. So a little bit scary there for directors. So let's turn to the next slide. What does this all mean for your business and disclosure? So there's an increased risk of litigation, of course. It affects not only how a potential defendant could operate in its disclosure, but also how they're delivering such services. So, for example, energy companies that may be subject to potential climate change litigation should note that its business documents and any of this climate disclosure reporting could be produced in litigation, including materials that were previously unlikely to be subject to disclosure. So of course, in litigation, you sort of have to open the kimono and you get a lot more information there. And so that could affect internal policies and approaches, with respect to how things are communicated, both internally and externally, really, because if you're disclosing climate related issues in an email, let's say, that could ultimately get produced in this type of litigation. There's also a trend of climate change claims against corporations that indicate that disclosure is a significant aspect of those potential claims. So, you have to think about, what do I need to do to meet the standards of disclosure if it's mandatory? And how can I also take a conservative approach? And you need to think about that in terms of data collection. So how much data do you really want to collect from your business? Do you want to collect, emissions from every stack at your plant that could get disclosed eventually in litigation and could make it more difficult for you? Or do you want to do an averaging, or do you want to do monthly reporting, or those kinds of things? So you need to be sensitive to those issues. You also need to be live to what's going on for Canada. What is it actually committing to? We've seen some more commitments through the Liberal government than maybe we were seeing through the Conservative government before it. It's always in flux, the politics here in this country. And so you could see more commitments by Canada. And are the companies then going to have to also meet those standards? We saw that in the Shell case. And in terms of goal setting and commitments, you don't want to set a goal that you can't achieve and that you can't have a reasonable plan in place to meet. So be aware that you could be put to task in terms of your goals or your action plans. Make them reasonable. Don't stretch yourself if you can't actually make that work. So, lots of issues to consider there in terms of how you deal with your business and how you deal with climate related risks there. So I will leave it there, and I understand questions will come at the end. So next slide, I think we can zip through to Perfect, thank you. And I'll now turn it over to Cal.
Thank you so much, Matty, and as well as Alina. Can I have the first slide, please? Thank you. What a wonderful setting and a segue to my presentation. Just for a 30-second introduction of Schneider Electric. We are a global company and deeply involved in energy automation solutions for efficiency and sustainability. On the left-hand side, it talks about Schneider Electric, which is really committed in terms of what we really do to ourselves and as well as for the customers. We are a committed company. We strongly believe in science-based targets. We will be committed and we will be there on 2025 for meeting our carbon neutrality. And we'll be net zero for our operations by 2030. 2021, we were recognized as the most sustainable company in the world by Corporate Knights. And also we have the CDP on the A list 10 years in a row, and as well as the MSCI, the AAA rating for the past 10 years. So that's what we have been earning ourselves in terms of credibility on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you can see we have helped a number of customers, hundreds of customers around the world in terms of meeting their goals, their expectation in terms of energy efficiency, and also bringing about sustainability. That is in a nutshell what Schneider Electric does. Now, can I have the next slide, please? I think thanks to again, Lena and Matty for setting this one. We did not really compare our slides before then, but then the essence is rightly there. Voluntary disclosure is one side, the other one is that mandatory disclosure. But the fact remains all over the world, ESG disclosure, the mandatory part of this is on the rise. Lena in her presentation talked about the green taxonomy of EU, what it really means from a financial sector. I think she summarized that very, very well in that. Move on to the third one is basically the US monetary policies, how they're really drawn to talk about the Securities and Exchange Commission, so on. SEC related issue, which is basically on March 21st. Matty summarized that very, very well in her presentation. But the rest of the world, for example, UK, Japan, and New Zealand, and so on, they are also taking this to the next level. So, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, abbreviated as TCFD, is on the rise. And then let's talk about Canada. I think Matty did, illustrate what is going to happen in Canada and so on. So there is a lot of information in there. But simply speaking, what's really relevant is that mandatory reporting is coming as early as 2024 in Canada. So I think that really sets the pace to say, hey, is this important? Disclosure is all about facts. Disclosure is all about the data that you have. And how do you go about getting that? And that's where probably some of the pain points starts in many companies that we have worked with. Can I have the next slide? Most of the time, the reporting challenges or disclosure challenges vary by organization. Some of them may have stakeholder involvement. Maybe the leadership is not really committed and so on. So there is an internal executive stakeholder that really need to say, yes, I stand behind it, we completely support it and so on. And that will really enable a faster disclosure of facts to the community. Second, there may be adequacy of data questions. Is data sufficient enough? What do you have on hand? Is that sufficient enough for you to disclose and fulfill your requirement? That's the second one. Third one is strategy. What is exactly the roadmap that you will get there? I think Matty was talking about how do you really get there is that start in the basic form, then mature yourself over the period of time, because this ESG compliance is a journey. It's not a weekly affair, it's not a monthly affair, but then it's absolutely up to us to do that. Then the last one is that the resources that are needed in terms of time, in terms of resources that you need in terms of manpower to do that. These are fundamentally the reporting challenges one may have in terms of getting a very good reporting done on the ESG. And have the next slide, please. You don't have to really wait for all the data to come in. So our approach working with hundreds of customers all over the world is that start thinking about what is the basic information that you have today for an ESG reporting. Then you can think about that moving into better and ultimately into the best form of reporting. So you don't have to really wait to get all the data in order, all the compliance is in order, and so on. So there's a 3 fundamental levels of ESG reporting: basic, and there are many companies who have already started to do that. And there are certain companies who are definitely, and the second one is basically better. And there are definitely people who are not comfortably on the best because they have been using that practices to get themselves basic, better, and best. So there are several definitely levels. We'll also take an example to show how that really works in practice. Compliance to local and national obligations is definitely needed. And that's what really will take you to the best level of compliance. I don't have to read through all the bullets, but you can really see where the materiality really feels and plays very, very well in basic, better, and as well as the best form of reporting. Can I have the next slide, please? One of the easy ways of thinking on implementing a practical approach for ESG reporting is to think about foundational components. For any form of ESG reporting, there are 5 basic things which we will call it as foundational components. One is the priority of topics to address, what they should be, and so on. This varies from one industry to another industry. The level of materiality, that's the second one. Depth and the frequency of disclosure, which Matty alluded to as well. And then ratings, rankings, and guidance. You need some guidance as to what to report, when, and what, and things like that. And finally, key frameworks and certification. If you closely see, the first 3 of them, which we call as foundational components, have to be done by the organization mostly, by the resources and so on, and the leadership committing to it. But where people really need help in the navigation part of it. What ratings should I consider? What rankings should I be looking for? And lastly, what sort of certifications are important in my sphere of activity? Because the e-mobility will be completely different from a plastics company and so on and so forth. So that is something where navigation is very, very important, and regulations and practices are changing. And therefore, that is where a lot of guidance is needed today. Again, if I take an example, one of the foundational components is the first one, priority topics to address. That may be again split up into what you really can do as in a basic form, in a better form, and as well as the best form of reporting. You can see the extent of material is reflecting throughout the basic, better, and best. At the same time, it also talks about scope 1. Do we really be bothered about it in the basic? Not so much. But in second, which is basically the better form of reporting, which is the next level, you have to be thinking about energy consumption of scope 1 and scope 2 are very, very important to be placed in the better category. And the last one, it really talks about the scope 3 as well. So embracing the entire ecosystem is really what you get to the best position. Can I have the next slide, please? Here is the alphabet soup. And you will probably see all kinds of acronyms in here. This is what takes in terms of navigating the ESG reporting. Simply speaking, I put this as a landscape that every industry has to deal with. There is voluntary frameworks. There is a number of them. Then there is data aggregators. You will see a number of organizations who do that. Then there is ratings and rankings and so on. And finally, certification. So if you really look at this stuff, there's a lot of things to navigate. And for a basic beginner, this may be quite something, they need to be reconciled with, and then they have to work with this. Here is where we have helped a number of organizations worldwide in every region and so on to help them move from basic to better and really become the best in those categories. So can we have the next slide, please? I'll take an example, a typical Canadian example. This is Maple Leaf Foods. In 2021, Maple Leaf Foods celebrated 2 years for first major carbon neutral food company in the world. It has been done and it's an Ontario headquarters company. It's a Canadian company, and that has accomplished this feat. And how would they do that? They exactly followed the basic, better, and the best approach in terms of what they should be reporting, what are the framework they should be considering, and so on. And we have been a privileged, I would say, supplier working very tightly with this customer, Canadian customer, where they really thought about it should be a TFCD reporting, but it should be a SASB, and then should we also have the framework to include Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP. And that's how they thought about it a few years ago. And in 2021, they had this credential for themselves. I'll take just one example of the data reporting and then conclude. Can I have the next slide, please? People, planet, and profit. Most of the industries, they use this, the 3P word. And here is an example why data is so material and why materiality is so important for sustainability and ESG reporting. This is Better Planet. If you look at Maple Leaf Foods, this is exactly what they really measure. And then here is how they publish their results, whether it's total energy intensity, whether it is natural gas intensity, how they use that, including waste, food losses, and so on and so forth. This is how they measure, monitor, and then disclose to earn their ESG credential. This is one example, and there are several reported data examples. So that may summarize how Maple Leaf got to where they are today. And they are continuing to do. This is a journey. They have to be doing this every year after year with more authenticity, with more, I'd say, integrity based on data. Can I have the next slide, please? Just to summarize, given the pace which regulations unfolding all around the world, we talked about EU, we talked about what's happening in North America with the SEC, what's going to be coming to Canada, and so on. We also talked about the other parts of the world, like UK, New Zealand, and so on. So it is just a matter of time, and that level of, I would say, requirement for any industry is only going to go up. So it's really poised to grow. Second, any company or any organization would definitely like to think about setting their ambition first, select your ESG level of reporting. You may already have some data, so you might be straight away starting with better instead of going to the basic. So be it. Review the data on hand, clearly have a team of people to look and organize and so on, and solicit your help. Work with your stakeholders if needed, definitely. One of the beauties and the essence of sustainability reporting is that documenting the transition where you are from a baseline perspective and moving to show progress, and disclosing the transition is the essence of sustainability reporting. So documenting the transition is important, and disclosing how the transition has helped to get from where you are to where you are now, that's what it is. So the concluding thing is that definitely start reporting if you're not started already, because by 2024, hopefully in Canada, there should be policies for mandatory reporting. And further, I think it's going to go up, aided by our carbon tax and so on, which is almost about $50 right now. So start reporting is a good thing to take away. And I'll finish up with my concluding slide. Can I have the next slide? That is from Larry Fink, BlackRock. Every company and every industry will be transformed. And this transition to a net zero world is so important. The question is, will you lead or will you be led? I think I conclude that session, and thanks again for my fellow presenters, Nati and Lena, for cooperating and having this message. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Cal. And thank you, Lena and Maddie as well. We'll move on to a Q&A here. I didn't see any questions coming in, but maybe some people are just holding out. So pass it off to you, Alicia. And I think you also had a question as well, Alicia.
And if it's okay, can I ask a question to Lena, please?
Please do. Sure.
Sure, yeah. Thank you so much for sharing Skandinaviska Enskilda Bankens group presentation. One of the questions that comes from my side as an industry supplier and working with our customer is that how is carbon tax I would say, influenced some of your thoughts from an investing and banking perspective? Has it increased the debt, or has it helped in most of your customers looking favorably into seeking the advice of investment from bankers such as yourself?
I think that's a great question. And actually, late last year, we have presented our new, and it wasn't new, but it was the first time that we presented it, our sustainability strategy, and basically the way we classify our clients based on their sustainability performance. So it has definitely affected the way that we look at clients, especially when it comes to onboarding new clients. And it's SEB is a very old bank, so we have been active in the Nordics for over 100 years, and that means that we have some clients that are in the fossil industry. So we do have to, and we have very strong relationships with those clients, but we still have certain targets, just like Schneider Electric, moving towards net zero future. So yeah, so I without going too much into detail, actually in one of the slides that I was going to share earlier, there is a link to our sustainability strategy where our CEO talks about it in much detail. And yeah, but the short version, I can say that is definitely affecting the way we look at clients, especially when it comes to new clients. And in the SME space specifically, we are looking to make it mandatory actually to see that our clients are reporting on their sustainability performance as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So we talked a lot today about climate metrics, ESG metrics, financial metrics. Do we see a shift coming as far as the UN SDG metrics? We noticed throughout our research that companies like Nike are already reporting on those types of things. And Cal, at Schneider Electric, is this something that's already happening at your company?
We report 5 barometers. We call it as the ESG barometers that we really publish. In fact, every quarter, I think we do that. And these are the so-called sustainable barometers that we publish. The idea there is that we link that to SDG, but then we really do not, I mean, if you, very simply speaking, the way to explain is that you take the SDG framework of 17 different goals, but then there are attributes that really come out of it. And we select this, what will be the most, I would say, valuable KPI that can be linked to their sustainable barometer that will be reflective of our industry. And that's what we publish every quarter from a Schneider Electric perspective.
Maddie or Lena, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, I'm the lawyer, so I can't necessarily disclose the companies that I'm working for, but what I would say is that I am getting more and more requests to assist with how to define climate-related risks for the purposes of disclosure. As we know, it's not mandatory right now, but because people are looking for financing and maybe some of these larger financial investors are more, concerned about it. We heard that from, Lena's side. We end up with sort of a voluntary movement there, and we are seeing more and more of it.
Yeah, and speaking of the 17 SDGs specifically, that is something that is very common in reporting when it comes to sustainable financing and even outlining the projects that the company seeks to finance. So, the 5 steps that I was talking about, usually a company will outline that in a specific document, which is called a green financing framework or maybe sustainability financing framework. And very, very often you will see links to specific SDGs in that framework.
Excellent. And we just got a question in from Ashley. So how does one receive funding for producing carbon neutral or lessening the need for fossil fuels for off-grid or northern communities? And I assume that's probably here specifically in Canada. We're worldwide. Okay.
I guess as a banker, I can come in with an answer. I think it really depends on the size of projects and the scale, because there's of course a difference on how the financing is done. But I think it is definitely possible. I'm unfortunately not familiar with what the Canadian banks are doing when it comes to smaller scale, I assume, financing, but I'm sure that they are also have solutions available for companies seeking to engage in these types of projects. And not only Canadian banks, but I can say, for example, from SEB side, even though when it comes to smaller size companies, we don't currently have any clients outside of Nordics and Baltics. However, we have provided advice on sustainable financing for the provinces of Quebec and Ontario in Canada. So it is still possible to, for example, just provide advice on how such financing can be done on, but it needs to be done in a kind of case-by-case basis.
Okay, I see we're a minute past time here. I see Ashley also said, would you also be in Croatia? I assume that would be a yes. Maybe Lena, you can nod your head or.
I don't think we have an office in Croatia, but I think it depends on the project. We could potentially provide advice on projects in Croatia, yes.
Awesome. All right, well, I don't want to keep you guys too much longer, but thank you so much for joining us today. It was wonderful presentations. And thank you to all our participants for joining us as well. As I mentioned in the comments, we will be sharing slides with people who request them. So you can email me, rgradine@deassociation.ca, and we will be sending out the recording to everyone as well. So thank you, everyone, and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.